Buenos días a todos. Hi, everyone. Welcome to be here with us in these diálogos transdisciplinarios sobre sostenibilidad. We have the honor to have today Dr. Florian Kern. Daniel Olivares will do the big introduction to Dr. Kern. But the idea to have this conversation about sustainability, transitions, change, is because we believe as the Center for Energy Transition and the university thinking about energy, how we change the world about energy, we believe that the transition are bigger or greater than the energy part. It's a transition that involves all of us. And this is part of the idea of these talks about sustainability. And today, Professor Kern will talk us about a big picture about the transition. So, Daniel.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Voy a cambiarme al español un poquito para hablarle a nuestros estudiantes. I'll switch into English right after. ¿Les gustó el cambio de lugar, muchachos? ¿Sí? ¿Lo podemos mantener? ¿No? Sí, bueno. Sí, llegaron mucho más rápido, algunos me dijeron. Bajaron de 1 hora a 5 minutos en llegar. Qué bueno, sí, me gusta el cambio de venue también, así que quizás lo mantenemos. Muchas gracias por la convocatoria, gracias, María Paz, gracias también por animar a los estudiantes a venir. Bueno, esta es la tercera charla de nuestro ciclo, muchachos. Siempre me gusta recordarles por qué creamos este ciclo de charlas. Y la razón es que como director de carrera, y habiendo pasado por la dirección de CENTRA también, lo que queremos con los otros 2 directores de los programas, ¿cierto? Con Rodrigo como director de CENTRA, con Ya como director de nuestro magíster profesional del área, queremos empezar a impulsar esta mirada transdisciplinaria en la formación de nuestros profesionales y también en los grados más avanzados que ofrecemos, porque creemos que es lo necesario en el sector hoy en día, donde tenemos que empezar a cuestionar mucho las formas actuales en las que hacemos las cosas, para acelerar la transformación, ¿ya? Y en esta tercera charla tenemos el honor de contar con el Dr. Florian Kern, y déjenme dar una breve introducción a quién es Florian, quién es nuestro speaker today. Florian es el jefe del grupo de investigación en economía ecológica y política ambiental y coordinador temático de las áreas innovación y tecnología y política y gobernanza en el Instituto de Investigación en Economía Ecológica, que tiene sede en Berlín, Alemania. Es doctor en estudios de políticas de ciencia y tecnología por la Universidad de Sussex en Reino Unido, y tiene un magíster en planificación tecnológica y socioeconómica de la Universidad de Roskilde en Dinamarca. En el año 2024 fue elegido presidente de la Sustainability Transitions Research Network, que es una red de colaboración internacional para avanzar el conocimiento en transiciones sostenibles. Su investigación se centra en las políticas y dinámicas asociadas a las transiciones hacia la sostenibilidad, especialmente en sistemas de energía, alimentación y movilidad. Entre los años 2005 y 2018 trabajó como académico en el Science Policy Research Unit, SPRU, de la Universidad de Sussex, donde fue además codirector del Sussex Energy Group y director asociado de la revista Research Policy entre el 2017 y el 2023. Y hoy día nos trae una charla que está titulada Transiciones hacia sistemas energéticos más sostenibles, progreso, políticas públicas y dinámicas políticas. Entonces ayúdame a darle la bienvenida a nuestro invitado today. Thank you, Florian. The floor is yours now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind invitation to come to this beautiful university, to this beautiful city. I've never been to Chile before, so I was very happy to receive this invitation. I'm very glad I'm here, and my apologies that I have to speak to you in English. I unfortunately don't speak any Spanish. I didn't learn any Spanish. And then I was speaking to a colleague from Peru at my institute, and she said, "Oh, don't worry. Even if you did speak Spanish, you would go to Chile and you wouldn't understand anything at all anyways. And you'd be even more frustrated that you think you learned Spanish and you couldn't talk to people. So we'll stick with English for today. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for the kind introduction and invitation. Okay. You already know the title, so I'll move on. Okay, so this is the structure of the talk. I'll talk a little bit about energy transitions and why do we think they're necessary. Then to talk about what are these transitions, what do I mean when I say transition, because of course you also have the word here, but maybe we don't mean the same things, we will see. This is part of the dialogue, I think. Very quickly, 2 slides about progress and how things are unfolding now in the energy transition, and then speak about the policies and the politics of this thing, which is sort of 2 of the areas in which my research has focused on for the last 20 years or so. Okay, so I think this is pretty clear to most people in the room. That's probably why you're here. That's probably what motivated you to engage with energy systems, because energy is the backbone of everything we do, right? Modern societies cannot really function without energy, and global energy demand is still increasing. Global population is increasing, so we need loads of energy to do the activities we want to do. But the way we use and produce energy has a number of side effects, both in terms of environmental effects, but also in terms of political security concerns, energy security concerns, but also social concerns around energy poverty, people not having access to energy service at the prices they can afford, or are not physically connected to networks, which is a problem in many countries around the world. So I'll quickly go through these slides because I think you're all familiar with these types of issues. So obviously, one of the biggest environmental threats that we're facing as the world is climate change, alongside with the loss of biodiversity, which is the other big crisis in the environmental domain. And you all know that, of course, this problem concerns mainly the energy sector, because that's where loads of the emissions come from, the burning of fossil fuels. And of course, you know that there is an international agreement, UNFCCC, about reducing at least the increase in temperature in the Paris Accord to 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's now, according to many scientists, very little chance we'll actually meet that target. The scenarios, of course, the longer emissions still keep rising, then the steeper the down what slope has to be, and at some point it's just no longer feasible. And of course, there is this international agreement, and there has been lots of action taken at the international and the national level, but it's not enough because globally emissions are still on the rise. Apart from climate change, of course, there are other environmental impacts that our current energy system has in terms of air and water pollution. There are, of course, problems with sulfur emissions that come from burning coal in power stations. You see the picture in the middle is Beijing and the smog, and I heard here you also have this problem, but I had the privilege to come in yesterday by plane, and it was a beautiful and clear sky, wonderful view on the mountains, but many people have said, well, this was lucky. Normally it's not like that. So I'm grateful I arrived on the right day. And then, of course, water pollution. The picture on the right-hand side is open strip cast mining of tar sands in Canada. It's not very pretty and causes a lot of environmental damage. Energy security is also, of course, an important consideration for people in the energy industry, but also energy policymakers is one of the main goals of energy policy in almost every country. I mean, there are obviously countries that have a lot of reserves, and then they're fine. And then there are a lot of countries, like my country where I come from, Germany, which is very dependent on energy imports. And this politically first became an issue, of course, during the OPEC crisis in the 1970s, which was one of the reasons why companies back then started investing in alternative sources of energy, such as renewable energies, which were extremely inefficient, extremely expensive back then. But this was one of the impetus to think about alternatives because of this dependency on imported fossil fuels from a world region that is pretty unstable. And we'll see that today, of course, you know, with all the different wars going on in the Middle East. In Europe, we also have a specific problem in terms of our dependence, and especially Germany, in terms of our dependence on Russian gas. Germany has received a lot of gas imports from Russia, even during the Cold War, mainly fine, until it was not. And this is, of course, one of the problems, that energy systems are very capital intensive. You have huge infrastructures, you have big investments in gas networks, pipelines from Russia into Europe, and then, yeah, you'll know that Russia attacked Ukraine 3 years ago and cut off Europe from its gas supplies. Of course, there are other types of disruption. I mean, this is what the headlines in the media always make when there is a disruption that is kind of politically enforced. But of course, you will know that I heard yesterday that you also had a big blackout here for a number of reasons. So there are other reasons why supplies of energy can be unstable. You can have industrial action, people striking, blocking streets. There can be technical failures. There can be natural disasters, of course, that interrupt supplies. And so energy security is better framed in this wider way of other types of disruptions, not just these geopolitical events. And then, of course, there's also an economic side to this, because it's fine if you physically have access in principle, but you're unable to afford it. And so then the wider definition of energy security is also including this ability to afford. Point that, you know, gas prices, for example, in Europe were super high in the first winter after Russia attacked Ukraine, because we didn't have a lot of alternative supplies, and then had to bring in LNG terminals to get the supply going. Of course, the prices of that were much higher than everything else. So gas prices, heating prices for people went up a lot. And then, yeah, as I said, I mean, I'm from Germany, and in Europe generally we have good energy access in physical terms, but even in Europe you have a problem with energy poverty. For example, we mentioned the University of Sussex. I was based in the UK for more than 12 years, and there are pensioners that have very small incomes, and they're unable to afford heating their homes, and just focus on one room or use blankets to keep warm. So even in so-called rich and industrialized countries, you have problems with energy services being too expensive for at least part of the population, of course. And then, of course, globally, if you think about it, you know, there are many people still living, millions, hundreds of millions of people in countries such as India and in parts of Africa, which don't really have access to these modern energy services. And this is a problem because, of course, the access to energy at affordable prices is also considered a precondition for human development. And in many of the emerging economies, energy demand is rising very quickly. Most OECD countries is rather declining, but overall, the energy hunger of the world, so to say, is still increasing. Okay, so the hypothesis this whole line of research is based on is basically to say, well, we need to move away from energy systems as they're organized now. Even though they work relatively well, they have all these side effects and problems I was talking about. And this is true for energy, but of course it's also true for mobility or the food system or housing. And one of the issues is that because they work relatively well, all the elements are relatively well aligned, they're actually very, very difficult to change, and they're kind of locked in existing fossil fuel-based unsustainable trajectories. So what we need is, the proposition is system innovation, a transition. It's not just about innovation, it's partly about innovation, but and diffusion of new technologies, but it's changes in whole systems. And this is also, I know, here in the program, very important to focus on the systemic nature of these things. So I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And the main reason why we're saying that kind of system optimization or partial system redesign is not enough is the type of, you know, improvement in environmental efficiency by maybe a factor 10 that is required to meet these targets I was talking about. And therefore, of course, you can have coal-fired power stations and you can invest in innovation. You can have better filters to filter out more of the sulfur. You can do that. There are technological fixes for that. That's fine. You can increase the efficiency of those power plants from 42% to maybe 43, 44, 45, 46. But then it's already super difficult technically to raise the efficiency more. So of course, these things help. You know, if China builds a new generation of coal-fired power stations that are 5% more efficient, that's a lot of emissions we don't have. But it's not enough to get to the kind of trajectory we need to be on in order to meet the Paris goals, for example. So what are these, what we call sustainability transitions? How can we understand such processes? Well, the transition is really this idea that you have current arrangements. You see here pictures from the energy system, from the mobility system, or from food. And this is sort of the status quo. And the question is, how do we get to these more sustainable configurations that you see on the right-hand side of the slide? And the process in between, we call a transition process. And it has maybe different phases to it. I don't want to spend much time on this, but this is the kind of idea that this transition is a long-term process in the way a particular societal need, such as the provision of energy services, is met. And people have been doing a lot of historical case studies on these, because of course the energy system that we have now and that we like and that it's efficient, and we flip the lights on and they come on and we use the projector, you know, it works, it's great. But of course it has not always been like that. So historically, of course, we've had all sorts of different energy sources, and we can move from using one set of technology sources and fuel inputs, but it's not quick to do, and it's not easy. And the most important point maybe is that, of course, it involves changes in technologies and the infrastructures, but there's also lots of non-technical changes that are also required for these types of transitions to occur, and they're also non-linear processes. There can be setbacks, backlashes, unexpected turns. And there are, of course, also multi-actor processes. So there's no one single actor globally that turns, you know, a lever somewhere and then the world sort of develops a new energy system. It's loads and loads of decisions about investments by individual companies, about governments, about international organizations, so on and so forth. So it's a very distributed decision-making process that we're talking about. And so lots of this research that I draw on here in this talk is coming from the field of innovation studies, where the focus has often been on kind of single technologies, like understanding how new technologies come about, and mostly focused also on the producers of these technologies, on the companies that are developing this, or are the R&D labs that are developing these new technologies. And the idea here in this literature is to shift that focus to also focus more on the use of these technologies and how they're being utilized within society, what kind of societal structures they require or draw on. And that's why this focuses not on individual supply technologies and says, okay, we need to replace coal with something else. It focuses on, okay, how do we currently meet in any given country? You can do an analysis. How do we currently meet our energy needs? What are the systems? What are the actors? What are the networks? What are the rules that bind together this system? And then study how these dynamics play out. So that's also important, that this focus on institutions understood broadly as rules that mainly provide inertia and stability, but then also thinking about how rules can change and how there is this dynamic interplay between the actors, the structures, and the networks they draw on. And so this is an interdisciplinary literature. I said maybe many of the starting points came from the field of innovation studies and the economics of innovation, but it's been enriched by ideas from sociology or institutional theory, political science, international political economy, and so on and so forth. So a variety of fields this literature draws on. And as I said, the focus is not on this optimization of existing systems, but on this process of moving from unsustainable energy systems to more sustainable energy transitions. And when we say, okay, it's a systemic perspective, what is it, what do we mean by it? And here, this is an example for the land-based transportation system. And as you can see, it includes, of course, the vehicles, you know, internal combustion cars is the dominant model so far. It, of course, includes a fuel infrastructure. You know, the petrol has to come from somewhere. There has to be oil companies producing that and then distributing it and so on. And then there have to be at the end, the consumer end of things, petrol stations to fuel your cars. So that's all fine. And these are the artifacts and these are the technologies and these are the infrastructures. But around that, of course, there are a whole range of different factors that also come into play. If you think about the culture and symbolic meaning of individual cars, you know, that's your freedom, that's your, I'm from Germany, so we're very proud of our car industry and people are generally very fond of their cars, and then it's, you know, it's an expression of individual freedom and of your status, your social status. If you have a big BMW, you know, that's a sign of social status. So it's not just about an efficient way of getting from A to B. Then no one would drive in a city like Berlin, where you have a very good public transportation system that reaches every point in the city, where there's no congestion normally, you know, like you have. But people drive their cars because they like their cars, because it's a status symbol and so on and so forth. So this really influences what we can do in terms of a transition. Because of course you could say, well, in the big cities, you don't really need cars. So let's get rid of the cars and let's focus on public transport. But we don't. It's very difficult to get rid of this idea that, you know, the car is an important status symbol. Even though it's not efficient and it's extremely expensive, of course. This is one of the curious things when you talk about, you know, energy and people, oh yeah, how about, you know, putting solar PV on your roof? oh no, that's super expensive. What's the payback time? These same people would never ask that question. What's the payback time of your BMW? You buy it for a lot of money, you drive it for 1 year, and the value of that car has dropped by 50%, maybe in the first 2 years. That's like the worst investment on the planet, right? So it's funny, but this is people. We're not just focusing on the economics and paybacks and returns and so on and so forth. We're people. We have a social and a cultural understanding in life, and this influences what we can do in terms of energy transitions. But of course, there's a whole lot of regulation and policies about traffic rules and parking charges and all the rest of it. There's a huge industry in terms of maintaining and distribution networks. So you have car dealers. There's actually a super interesting social innovation that made this car-based mobility system possible, which was the idea that you get a loan to buy a car. Because initially, when cars, were spreading in Europe in the 50s, it was too expensive for most people to buy a car or to save up money to buy a car. And so the car companies were very clever. There's such a thing as the Volkswagen Bank. They were set up by Volkswagen because they found actually most people are not able to just buy a car because they don't have the money. Oh, we have a brilliant idea. We give them a loan, charge them interest for it to buy our car. How brilliant. It's a great social innovation. I mean, this was unknown before. Before people, saved up until they had money and then they could buy something. Oh no, we give you a loan for your car. And the car is, of course, the second most expensive investment people will make in their lifetime. Maybe they will buy a house or a flat, but then the second most expensive thing is the car. I'll give you a loan, yeah. And we earn extra money by doing so. It's you have to think about it. So, and now, of course, the car dealers are also a big obstacle in the transition. They have all these showrooms with these nice, fancy internal combustion, quick cars that drive 250 kilometers on the Autobahn for no good reason. Because in most countries they sell those cars, there's a speed limit, so you can't drive them at that speed, but this is the dominant trajectory they're on, and they like these luxury big cars that are not very efficient. Yeah, but that's our industry. That's in the industrial structure. There are interests behind that. They want to continue selling these cars, and they have no competences in terms of producing electric engines in cars and all the electronics required in cars nowadays. They focus on this technological trajectory very much on how to improve the efficiency of the diesel engine, until they couldn't and started cheating to meet the rules. Okay, so as I was saying about, this is our understanding of a socio-technical system. It's very encompassing. It has all the different actors, the companies involved in the industry structure, the car manufacturers, the suppliers, and so on and so forth. And then, as I also said, you get kind of markets and user practices. Whatever you pay at the fuel pump in most countries is predominantly taxes, not actual costs of these things. And of course, that's also a way of steering people. In Germany, we have, for example, tax rebates for diesel. It's not particularly environmentally friendly, but this is cheaper because there's less tax on it. So all of these things are very much aligned and work well together in the current system. And that's great because it works relatively well. But this is also what makes it so difficult to move to a different type of system, because you would need to change all of these elements for this transition to work. And this is a very busy slide, I apologize, but it's actually relatively simple. It's thinking about who's involved in producing this system in terms of the technical variations, the new technologies, the improved technologies. This is on the left-hand side, and of course there is a role for universities that do research, but even schools and education. I mean, to have good engineers, you need to have good education in your schools and STEM training and so on and so forth. Then you need skilled people, let's say, in factories that build these technologies. Then you have design firms and technical institutions, consultancies that develop standards, and different firms and engineers and designers. And then, of course, you also have to have people who give you the money to invest in new things, so venture capital or banks or insurance firms. And then there's all sorts of suppliers of materials, components, tools, and so on and so forth. So these are all actors that are involved in the production side of these technologies. But then, of course, there's also the use. As I said, we need to move from just focusing on production to also consider what's happening on the use side of things. And there, of course, you have public authorities. For example, in Europe, there are fuel efficiency standards for cars across the European Union. So the EU is a very important rule setter. And of course, as I said, the taxation regimes of different countries, then about how much tax there is on different types of cars or fuels or gas or or carbon emissions and so on, and as you have in Europe. And then there's a whole thing around media as kind of influencers of what people want. You know, this is one of the excuses of the German car industries. Yeah, but people want these big cars, they want these SUVs, when they've spent billions over the last 10 years advertising these types of cars, telling people that they want and need these types of cars that are, of course, very much more inefficient than a smaller car. So that's, we already talked a little bit about our users and consumers and their preferences, and then also the people repairing cars, you know, servicing your cars. This is one of the problems with an internal combustion engine cars. You have to service it every 1 or 2 years, change the oil and the filters. It's actually quite a dirty thing. So they earn a lot of money by doing this kind of maintenance work. And electric cars don't have that. Electric engine just runs and runs and runs and has very little maintenance. You don't need to change the oil, you don't need to change any filters. So all of these people are very worried about a mobility system that's based on battery electric vehicles. And of course, there's also a role for societal groups like environmental NGOs or social NGOs that kind of push on some of these issues I was talking about earlier in terms of the costs or in terms of the environmental impacts of these things. And so there's an interplay between that. And it's all these different actors that are involved in these types of transition processes. This is an example, again, sorry, it's a bit complicated slide, but actually it's also very simple. So this is the timeline, and this is energy consumption for lighting in the United Kingdom. So this is the kind of historic case studies people have been doing, and yeah, and then it's just the share, the composition of that. How is this demand being met? So this is the point about what's the dominant way of fulfilling a certain energy services in this example, lighting. And you see there in the 1800s that people used candles. So this is what I was saying about how we have it now is not the end of history. And also before it, also other things existed. So people used candles. For hundreds of years, we used candles to produce lighting. And it's not very efficient, it's very dirty, and you don't get a great quality of light, of course. And then we sort of converted mainly to gas lighting in terms of the street lamp, but also in people's homes. Of course, all sorts of issues with safety and so on and so forth. And then, you know, there was a smaller market share also of kerosene lamps, which are also very smelly and dirty and so on and so forth. And then you see here, this is about 1910, let's say, electricity comes along as a new service. And then you see how long it takes, sort of 50 years, until all lighting is basically provided by electricity. It took 50 years to squeeze out things like the use of gas. So this is why we're saying, well, if you look at historical transitions, most of them have been relatively slow. This is just one example of that. There are also others that took much longer, even sometimes 100 years, where you have an innovation and then, you know, this spreading throughout the system until it has kind of 100% of the market share often takes a long time. There's another example from domestic heating, for example. Most people used wood, and many millions of people in the world today still use wood for heating, and later used coal. But that transition, because it's, you know, if you go and collect fuel wood yourself, it's basically for free. So the idea that it's better to buy a product like coal, which is also dirty and nasty, instead of collecting your own wood, obviously wasn't particularly great to most people initially, and so it took 200 years for this to change. But then again, there are also case studies of transitions that happen much more quickly, maybe only 10 years. And so there is a big debate in this literature whether you can, in fact, speed up those processes, or why are some of these, why do they take 10 years and why do others take 100 or 200 years? Are there certain dynamics that we can try to analyze and understand, and that maybe also policymakers can focus on? Because, yeah, there is this paper by Benjamin Sovacool, who we discussed earlier already, where he looked at some cases where things have been quicker, such as the switch from town gas, which is an artificially produced gas, to natural gas, which in the UK, where, okay, it's one country and it's only one type of energy service, but this was basically a managed changeover process that took 10 years, where you had engineers coming into every house and converting the appliance, because the quality of the gas is slightly differently, so you couldn't just use it, so you had to come and do something to people's stoves to make that happen. But it, you know, happened across 40 million appliances in the UK over a 10-year time horizon. So can also be quicker is the argument. But as I said, there's this debate in the literature when some people say, oh, this is always going to be slow, and especially if we talk about the global, energy transition, then this is extremely slow and difficult. This is Fouquet arguing this, and then there are other people, including myself, that take a bit of a more optimistic perspective and say, well, often these were emerging historical phenomenon. If we now know we want a transition, and if we roughly agree on the direction in which we want to travel, then maybe there's also something we can do proactively to speed up this process. Now, I'll come back to that later. And yes, you probably, or maybe not, I don't know. One of the reason why it's so difficult to change things is also the idea of lock-in, that many technologies have increasing returns to adoption, and that you start with a certain technology, and then there's kind of chance historical events why this technology is being used more. Then it has an initial advantage. The costs decrease, which makes that technology even more attractive. And over time, and there's more adoption, more learning, more improvement, and then you're in this virtuous cycle. But of course, it also means that you lock out other alternatives. So this is still a big debate in nuclear engineering, for example. There was a certain reactor type that is dominant today in the world, was actually designed for the military, and they had, for nuclear-powered submarines. And so they had very specific requirements what this reactor would need to do, and that it would need to be relatively small so that it fits into a submarine. So there are certain technical characteristics of that technology, and then they spent loads and loads of money in developing this technology. And then this also became the dominant technology for the civil use of nuclear power, because they had already spent a lot of money on developing it. There were different reactor designs where engineers to this day say, well, they're much better in theory, but they never got that head start with the investment from the military, so they never, took off. You are all younger than me, mostly, so you have never seen a typewriter. So this is one of the famous historical case studies of why the keyboard is designed as it is. QWERTY is the progression of the keys on your keyboard, and it's lots of research shows that this is a very inefficient way of arranging the keys for how people type. It actually makes you slower than alternative configurations. But why do we have this strange keyboard? Why is it QWERTY? I mean, it makes no sense. I mean, in no language, QWERTY is any kind of sequence that you use, which you could easily type. Why do we have that? Well, because of course the initial typewriters had mechanical things moving, and they were designed so that you don't use two keys next to one another in a word, because they would jam mechanically. They would jam against each other, and then it would mess up your typing. So they were designed that you actually, use the keyboard so that things move in different places at the same time, or just after one another. This makes no sense today, right? We have digital things, nothing jams anymore. You can press any button or swipe or whatever, but this keyboard is still the same. This is lock-in. People have learned how to use these. Companies are producing them. No one wants to, once you've learned to use that keyboard, you don't want to learn a new keyboard. So we just stick with it, even though we know it's inefficient. This is a great, very down-to-earth example of lock-in. So in terms of progress with energy transition, and I'll speed up a little bit looking at the time. Actually, despite everything I've said, and I said, okay, we started developing in these alternative renewable energy technologies already in the 1970s. Very small amounts, of course, but now, if you look at the statistics of the International Energy Agency, every year they publish this World Energy Outlook. It's an important source of data, and they, and last year, 560 gigawatts of new renewables capacity was added, and that's across all countries in the world. And of course, this is unevenly distributed. One of the biggest countries was China, where they really added a load of new capacity. And so in many countries, coal and gas are now being squeezed out of the electricity sector, at least. And this is a rapidly increasing deployment of these technologies now. But it took us a long time to get there. Now, most renewables are cost effective with a little bit of subsidies. Some like offshore wind, of course, still need a bit of subsidies, but things like PV or onshore wind in most systems are pretty competitive these days. But when we reach that stage where you have mass deployment of these technologies, then there is also new problems occurring. One of them, of course, is social acceptance. But if you have a few wind turbines in a country, then people say, oh, that's fine, it's a clean and nice technology. And if you have many of them around where you live, people are then suddenly not so happy anymore. And so there's a lot of social science research on the role of, for example, energy co-ops, so bottom-up developments that local farmers put money together and invest together in a turbine, or a local city put solar PV on their town hall, and they're collectively investing in this, and then they get some economic returns. Or even if you have a commercial developer doing this, can they offer some local benefits to people? Can they get cheaper electricity rates, or can the local municipality get a cash payment for the fact that they're accepting this development? So, but there are all sorts of issues that are cropping up when you have more deployment. When there were just technologies that were researched in the lab, and then some pilot schemes, it didn't matter so much. But there are new types of problems now. There are also new technical challenges in terms of grid integration, and that the supply of renewables can be variable. So that these require different types of operation of power systems, and of course this requires investment, partly in generation, which we talked about, which is pretty cost competitive now, but also you need to upgrade the infrastructure, the grid. In Germany, for example, we had loads of wind power installed in the north, and then there's lots of industry in the south. So the north-south need to build new transmission grids, and of course, again, this is not so easy sometimes. And then smart meters or storage options like battery or hydro pump storage or something like that. And then, of course, there's also the challenge now of more integration. We talked a little bit about the use of electric cars. Of course, we have the ambition in Germany to be carbon neutral by 2045. So it's not just about the energy and the mobility sector, it's also about industrial sectors. So, the chemical sector is thinking about, how do we convert our processes where they still use a lot of fossil fuels to be carbon neutral? And the answer is, yeah, we can use lots of electricity. But then, the electricity consumption in Germany basically doubles. If just by the chemical industry moving to electricity. So it's loads and loads of things that you need to do also on the market design, things like capacity markets and so on, to ensure that the system can actually meet those demands. And then there's also this interesting political question about what's the role of the traditional utilities in such an energy system, where you have storage operators, where you have smart meters, maybe behind the meter action and in a home. What's their role, or are they being overtaken by other types of actors? So this is a big interesting. So the policies. Well, I think many of the studies show that these processes can occur naturally and have occurred naturally in the past. But if we want them to be quicker, and if we want to influence the direction in which they're going towards more sustainable configurations, then you need policy actions. And then there are, of course, also traditional intervention rationales, like you have market failures and therefore you have to have policy interventions. But here one could also argue, or people have argued, that there are also different types of failures here. There are transformational or system failures, that it's to overcome lock-in and so on and so forth. You need policies that both address the direction of innovation. So we don't want more innovation in making fossil fuel technologies 2% more efficient. We want to move to a system that's zero carbon. And we certainly don't have just one policy instrument. It's not just innovation policy, or it's not just electricity market reform and having a contract for different system. It's a whole lot of different things that we need to do in different policy areas to steer those transitions. And initially, I think the literature very much focused on the innovation part of things, which is an important part. You need new innovations, whether they be technical or social innovations, and so on and so forth. But increasingly, people are also saying, well, once we've developed the alternatives, we often find that because of these lock-in mechanisms, they really, even if they're relatively well developed and are relatively cost-effective now, they still find it difficult to break through into mass market. And so is there something that also needs to be done, not just in terms of fostering innovation, but in terms of fostering the phase-out or the exnovation or the decline of existing industries? And that's, of course, politically very difficult. And so people have developed this sort of not just thinking about this S-curve of diffusion of new innovations and how you can support those, but also thinking about the other part of the X-curve, that's of the decline, and what you could do there in terms of phase-out measures. And then do you have to compensate workers in these industries? In Germany, we're still using a lot of coal-fired power stations in our electricity system. We also still have lignite mining, which is extremely dirty and extremely inefficient coal. But what do we do in those regions where people have these jobs in the mining industries? And it's not that many. It's 20,000 workers in Germany still involved in mining activities in this lignite, and the hard coal has mainly closed already. But then one way of dealing with that is retraining schemes, lots of public investment in these areas. I think the German government now proposed, I think, a fund of 50 billion euros to spend on these regions to help them make the transition. So there are all sorts of things one can do policy-wise, push forward these transitions. The last point, I come to the politics about all of this. So, you know, you can show these slides and you say, oh, you know, sustainable development goals, and it's globally agreed, and everyone agrees, you know, climate action is important, and energy access, affordable and clean energy for all, and so on and so forth. So this is, at this level of objectives, everyone agrees, right? Who could be against clean water, sustainable cities, or climate action? But then, actually, how to get there is very contested, right? And this is why there are different paths in the forest that you can take. And of course, there's not one actor that chooses which path to travel. There are different actors, there are different interests that influence these choices. And so you have both private decisions, but companies, how they allocate their research portfolio, what investment they do in terms of new infrastructure, in terms of new generation plant, and so on and so forth. And of course, you have public policies that try to influence these decisions. But it's not one actor that can single-handedly sort of cause this transition to happen. And that's why there's a whole literature on these politics of these contested transition pathways. You know, there are countries in the world that say, okay, renewables is the future, we go 100% renewables. There are other countries that say, oh, but nuclear power is a really good source of energy. So, you know, they are embarking on building new nuclear power stations. Technically, the integration of those two worlds is not so simple. If you have a high, a high share of nuclear energy in your energy system, it's very difficult to then also have renewables alongside this, because the steering is then very difficult. And then, of course, there's countries with fossil fuel reserves that say, oh, we need just carbon capture and storage to make our energy system sustainable. And of course, that has a whole range of things. Also, in terms of, you know, what's the scale? Do we move from the very centralized, large-scale system that we have to a more decentralized, small-scale installations? PV on people's roofs. Okay, it's small-scale, decentralized. You use most of your energy yourself. The rest, maybe you sell to the grid. And then at times when you don't produce, you buy something back from the grid. It's very different from, okay, we operate offshore wind parks like we operate our power stations. You know, they now are very big. They have a capacity of 1 gigawatt, like a nuclear power station, the biggest wind park. So it functions like a nuclear power station, but it's the same system. You have a very centralized point of generation, and then you need loads of infrastructure to distribute it out. And then you probably need a lot of storage as well. So these are all decisions that are being taken by actors, and they don't necessarily agree. I wanted to go into an empirical example. Daniel, do I have the time to do so, or rather not? Okay, so this is hydrogen. And of course, in many countries, there's a lot of hope on hydrogen as an important pillar of, you know, sustainable energy. And this is developed by a German government agency and an industry association. And they have this all-encompassing vision of hydrogen. So we use renewables to produce hydrogen, or we import it maybe as liquid fuel, and then we do steam reformation, and we do a lot of electrolysis and pyrolysis. Maybe we use even biomass, and then we use it to heat people's homes. We use it to store. We use it in industry. We use it for the production of synfuels, and then we use those in our transport sector, from cars to planes. So if you think about this, so we did a project on this in terms of, okay, what is the vision? Where does Germany want to go in terms of this hydrogen transition? Because the government had a national hydrogen strategy and said, you know, hydrogen is the important building block to finish the energy transition in Germany. And then you can think about this in terms of the production of hydrogen and the consumption in this kind of socio-technical world, the production and consumption. And so we came up with this metrics, and you see kind of here in this axis is there are actors that say, well, only green hydrogen is acceptable. So we only use renewables to produce the hydrogen. And then there are people who are more flexible and say, yeah, renewables is fine, but maybe we use also some blue. So that's produced from fossil fuel, but you do CCS to capture the emissions. And then the cleanish fuel or turquoise, this is from pyrolysis from methane. So different ways of producing hydrogen. I mean, it's just the color scheme. The hydrogen has no color, but yeah, it's just so it's different ways of producing this hydrogen. And then here is, okay, is it the silver bullet like on the slide before? We basically use it across the economy for heating people's homes, to e-fuels for planes and so on. And then there are more, you know, there are other positions to say, well, actually, there is not a lot of hydrogen production right now. We also probably don't have a lot of capacity in Germany to produce a lot of hydrogen, so we will need to import it. And maybe it makes sense to prioritize the hydrogen in sectors where you have no technical alternative. In the chemical industry or in steel production, for example, and do electrification everywhere else. You know, everywhere where you need lower temperatures is basically fine to use electric appliances. But so there are basically these 4 different pathways, and then we mapped actors' positions on these. And you know, the individual names of the actors don't matter, but the point is, there's not a lot of agreement. There are lots of industry actors in this camp here with the maximum diffusion pathways. Of course, these are also companies producing these technologies. It's, you know, not surprising that they say, well, we'll use it across the whole of the economy. And then, you know, opposite end of the spectrum, you see many of the environmental NGOs and civil organizations that say, well, you know, we understand hydrogen is important, but actually it should play a fairly minor role in this energy transition and only be used in specific sectors where we have no good alternatives. And also the policies and the policymakers, you know, we track the development of policies over time and what sort of hydrogen future they imagine or they support, and you know, they move around as well. And so the point of this empirical example is to show that transitions are very difficult because actors don't agree, and when actors don't agree, there's lots of uncertainty. You know, who's going to invest now several billion in upgrading a steel plant to run on hydrogen when you're not sure where you're going to get the hydrogen from? No one. So people don't invest. So we say we have these ambitious targets and we want so much deployment of hydrogen, but we don't get it. It's slow. It doesn't happen. And then, of course, there's also the politics of people protesting against wind turbines, protesting against new pipelines, protesting against, you know, nuclear waste storage facilities. No one wants this. That we don't have approved final depository for nuclear waste in Germany. This is from the UK, a picture. Airport expansions is also one thing. Is, you know, if we're talking about meeting climate change targets, should we really build new runways at airports, increase the capacity in the absence of things? And also, and then the last one is from the Netherlands. It's a picture about CO2 storage. So if you do CCS, you also have to store it somewhere. Also not very popular in many of the projects. So this is also to show that these transitions are also political because energy technologies or infrastructures are very contested by people. So I hope that this connected to some of the things you're interested in and have heard about before, and I'm very curious about your perspectives on these issues. But for me, I think the idea is that these social technical systems that I've introduced as a concept needs to change fundamentally over the next couple of decades for the whole range of reasons that we know from historical examples that these transitions can happen. So this is never the end of history, how things are now. We can make a change, but this cannot be done by any particular actor. You know, people always say, oh yeah, but China can do it. They have such a powerful government. Also in China, you have, you know, state-owned enterprises, you have a regional level of governance. It's also not just one actor, the central government, that can make, even in relatively centralized systems, you still have a lot of different actors involved in decision making and so on and so forth. And I also hope to have demonstrated that the transitions are also political, that the objectives or mainly also the pathways of how to get there can be very contested. Different actors can have very different ideas of what a sustainable energy system looks like. And I've also talked about the ability of policymakers to develop policy to influence the speed and direction of these processes, but also shown that this is not so easy, that there is politics and power that interferes with that. And maybe because I wanted to finish off with the hopeful thought that there are, of course, around the world, there are very many social movements that are trying to push for this, community energy groups, associations of community energy groups that are trying to make a change from the bottom up and are developing alternative energy systems, you know, local energy markets, you know, direct consumer to consumer trading and so on and so forth. And there are, of course, of macroeconomic and macro-political problems like the ongoing war in Ukraine and so on that put pressure on the existing system and has led Germany to reconsider the role of gas in these transition plans for the future. So if those two things combine, the sort of bottom-up pressure for change and also some top-down pressures on how things are now, then we can be maybe a little bit hopeful that as the world globally, we can make those changes required. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Florian. And now we have a space for questions. This is a dialogue, guys, so you can just have a reflection as well and have Florian comment on it. I don't know if someone wants to open the questions. Go ahead. Yes, please, so that it gets recorded.
Thank you. Thank you, Florian, for everything you've done today. It's amazing what you've talked. And I have some serious questions about money, because this energy transitions requires so much money. So one of the things that I've been thinking about while you were talking, it's that how can you get the money in regions that don't really have enough investment on it? Or how can you make them more attractive to get the money to get better energy? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is a very important challenge. And of course, there are all these predictions about how many billions of investment you will need globally or in certain regions of the world to make it happen. And we recently have done a project on finance and have looked at how the finance system operates. And it's literally crazy how the finance system operates. When they initially started taking on board climate risks, we couldn't understand what they were talking about. We met with all these financial, actors, and we didn't understand. And then we figured out that they have a completely different way of thinking about the world. They were thinking in terms of climate change as a risk to their portfolio. So they were, when they talked about banks and their portfolios, it was about making sure that they are not heavily invested in things that get destroyed by floods and what have you. They were not talking about spending money on things that would save the planet. And the problem, as we see it, the result of that project was really that there needs to be fundamental reform of the way the finance system operates for it to be able to support these sustainability transitions. Because the risk and reward ratio of many of the things that we want investment in clean energy is much worse than what they currently have. And as I said, most of renewable energy technologies are actually cost competitive now. But that doesn't necessarily mean they get invested in. Often, the capital expenditure on a big renewables project is very high, and it's upfront. Whereas for other types of energy infrastructure, you have fuel costs along the way, so you distribute the cost over a longer period of time. If you have a renewables project, you have all the upfront cost, and then you have no fuel cost, but you still have to service the loans. So they're very vulnerable to interest rate changes if you have to borrow the cash. And of course, this is not a problem the fossil fuel industry has, because they have deep pockets. They have billions of revenues, which they can spend on infrastructure. So they are not dependent so much on interest rate, because they have the cash, they don't need to borrow. It's also about the track record of individual companies, low carbon pioneers. If they are new companies, they don't have a track record, they don't have established relationships with a bank, that just means their cost of capital is higher than for the incumbents, which again is unfair. But that means all of these things together mean that this kind of reward ratio, the cost of reward ratio, is poor for financial investors currently, which makes it very difficult. And the point is, do politicians have enough guts to basically change some of these reward structures in the finance system that would generate more things? And of course, at an international level, there's also international funds that are trying to do what you were saying, bringing cash to regions where maybe it's difficult for them to raise the cash themselves as part of the UNCCC and other international initiatives. But yeah, probably more is required there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions?
Like a UN question, you have to throw us.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah, like for policymakers, they have to push towards some new technologies from day to day. And as in science, everything changes every day. I don't know, breakthroughs, I don't know, in mobility specifically. Now China using already, I don't know, salt batteries, and that makes, I don't know, lithium way fall behind because it's not something that's optimal for energy storage and so on because of environmental issues. So how does a policymaker make itself to be someone they can believe on, they can trust on, because they have to change from, like, I can say something today and tomorrow will be something different? Because things changes so fast. So how can be a policymaker so trustworthy when it has to change a lot of their, like, what they have to push towards something that's more environmentally friendly, or I don't know. How does it works for them?
Yeah, thanks. That's also a great question, and it's also one of the big challenges, of course. And the traditional policy response to that problem is to say, we don't decide, the market decides. We have technology neutral policies. And that has all sorts of problems, because technology neutral policies basically means that you leave it to the incumbents, and you focus on the technologies that are at the moment closest to market, which may not be the right thing to do long term. You know, in the 70s, it was a terrible economic proposition to invest in solar PV. It took decades of investments to get, you know, the costs down to where they are now. So this is one of the arguments for intervention, to say, well, actually, there is probably a public policy rationale in investing in things that are not cost competitive now, but may have great benefits in the future, because these are things the market will not necessarily invest in. You know, people like BP and Shell, they initially invested in solar in the 70s and 80s. And then they felt, well, the costs are not really coming down. And also, and this comes back to the finance question, you know, if you make a 10% return on your investments in new fossil fuel projects, then even something that is in principle cost competitive but only has a 3% return is not as attractive. So that's why I think that this policy makers both need to focus on this funding the new things and then also making the other things not as attractive as they currently are. But this is difficult, and policy often withdraw from that in terms of, oh, yeah, you know, as you say, things are always changing and we leave it up to the market. But it's probably the wrong way of going about it, and we're trying to show that with, you know, different studies of how they can have an influence. And of course, it is true that also, you know, I said, well, we want these sustainable energy transitions to happen, but from the outset now, we cannot tell how exactly that looks like in 20, 30 years down the line. So the point is, and the philosophy behind this policy approach is really to identify promising things, portfolio of things, investing in them now, and then, you know, as you say, things change. So every couple of years, you need to re-evaluate what is the role. You know, we have a national strategy now on hydrogen that had ambitious targets for the deployment and so on and so forth. But maybe in 5 years' time, you revisit that and you think, okay, actually, our outlook on this has changed a little bit. Batteries have improved much more. Maybe actually in the transport sector, we don't need any hydrogen at all, other than air travel maybe, but, you know, trucks and so on, big machineries. You know, 5 years ago, everyone said, well, this is impossible. You will need hydrogen. You fuel cell vehicles. You cannot, you know, these are too heavy vehicles. You cannot power them by, well, batteries have advanced a lot. So maybe you can now. So this is the point about, you know, making progress, experimenting with different solutions, and then sort of assess after a few years, okay, where have we got to? What's the state of the art? And also in competing trajectories, and then maybe changing the incentives again. And of course, then you can be, as you say, kind of accused for, oh, you've changed your mind and you're going back. And this is a difficult situation, because industry also always says, oh, we want certainty. If we now invest in this, we need to be sure that you're serious about this. Why would we spend our money on it? So this is a very difficult balance, but it is a balance we have to strike. There's no way around this problem, that on the one hand, you want to be flexible and you want to explore different alternatives, and on the other hand, you also need certainty to make investment happen.
Great. You have a question, Shah?
Oh, thank you, Florian. It's a great talk. Thank you so much for being here. I mean, my question is about, Florian, is about, when you think about this socio-technical configuration, so we understand there are many blocks, right? So, you know, pillars we can call. And here, the key challenge is here, though, because, I mean, each blocks, I mean, they have excellent opinion, the initiatives about sustainability. But the thing is how we can efficiently connect or link these blocks. Today, this one of the, I mean, I think key challenge is here. So how we can, because there are a lot of great initiatives, a lot of, if you got a finance guy, if you got a technology guy, they will talk you excellent. But when you come at connecting part, I think that we're missing a lot, and how we can find the best way to connect these blocks, right? So just, I want to listen your opinion. How do you think that we can handle this?
Yeah, thanks. That's a crucial challenge, of course, and it's not one when there is an easy answer. But I think the first step is to have this shared cognitive understanding that indeed these things are not just technical; they are socio-technical configurations. And I think this is fine for the engineers. They want that, they understand that. And I think it's also policymakers increasingly come to understand this. And also people in NGOs, I mean, a lot of them, of course, focus also on consumer behavior and, using less energy and more efficient lifestyles or more subsistence lifestyles. And I think the most important point is first have this cognitive idea together that it is a socio-technical change process and that we do want things to change. And even in incumbent companies, I think people know change is coming. And so for them, it's about engaging with this change and being able to influence the directions in ways in which they still have a business model tomorrow. So first, having this shared cognitive understanding, and then it's about negotiating, sitting together, the direction of change, bringing them to the table, discussing this together. And engineers are obviously very good at improving efficiencies, making things better, but maybe they're not so well attuned to the social aspects of it. And to bring that together and bring policymakers, bring people from industry, bring people from social movements or local policymakers from cities. Many of these problems are also local problems in terms of, if you think about the dominance of cars and so on in cities, that's city governments play an important role. So it's about bringing these different stakeholders together, and they might not necessarily agree on everything. Of course not. It's not about building a uniform idea, but this exchange and learning from each other, I think that this would be my hope, that this is a building block forward.
Great. Yeah. Okay, the last question. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, Florian. First of all, thank you so much for the talk here. It's very interesting and very entertaining for me. And my question is about green hydrogen. I've closely observed the application of new green hydrogen projects and new ways to transport it and storage, like green ammonia here in Chile. But I haven't heard much about the interest there might be in Europe to import this fuel, which could serve as an alternative to dependence on gas from Russia, Ukraine. Is there any interest in Europe regarding these potential imports without considering Germany and Netherlands?
No, there is a huge interest. And actually, this is one of the disagreements in Germany and also other countries is a bit like, if you frame hydrogen as the solution also of energy security issues, and then you look at the strategies, also the European Union has a hydrogen strategy, and then the vast majority is actually projected to be imported. And then the argument is, of course, yeah, but they're friendly countries and it's more dispersed. It's not so central, it's not, renewables potential across the world is much more evenly distributed in friendlier world regions than fossil fuel, which are very dominant in some countries and not so good. So there is a huge potential, and the German and the European strategy foresee that 60, 70, 80% of the hydrogen, the green hydrogen we'll be using in Europe will be imported. And as you say, mainly maybe the transport in the form of ammonia. So there's huge interest in that. And Germany has a lot of bilateral agreements already with countries in place where they say, it's kind of a memorandum of understanding stage where they say, oh, we're very interested in developing projects that produce the hydrogen and transfer it into ammonia and put it into ships. So there's not a lot of projects that are being built at the moment, but there's a huge interest and there's in principle a huge market for that. There are also some concerns from the academic side about this as a kind of a new form of colonialism, because often then these projects don't really benefit local people so much, right? There are big investment projects done maybe by international investors, and especially if you do them in regions that are not well served yet in terms of their own energy needs. Some people find that problematic, and other people focus more on the ability to generate export revenue I mean, Chile's development model, as I understand it, is based on this kind of global market integration and being the supplier of things like copper and salmon and kind of focusing on these export industries. And to some extent, you can say, well, there has been some trickle down, and it is, but this is also contested in the literature, so I don't want to be too strong on this. But yes, the simple answer is yes, there's loads and loads of interest, and all the projections are that the majority of that hydrogen, the green hydrogen we'll be using, will be imported at both of the European level, but also in individual countries such as Germany or Netherlands.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Florian, again. This was a great...
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It was brilliant to be here. Thanks for all your great questions and discussion.
Let's give a final round of applause to Florian. Para aquellos que vayan a usar el bus de acercamiento a Peñalolén con Carla, por favor. Muchas gracias por venir. Thank you so much.